All right. Um, Next up, we have Mr. Stephen Kriby. He's going to present to us Requiem for the Password. His bio is he's a security engineer for Bright Spring Health Services in Louisville, Kentucky, and he has been involved in technology since the late 1980s. But whenever he's not working, he would rather fish for some bass. So, Mr. Kriby, go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you, Trenton. Yeah, I'm Steve Kriby from Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm glad to talk to you all this afternoon about passwords and their role in security and how that's going to be changing in the relatively near future. As Trenton said, I've been around for a while. Once upon a time, I was a graduate student in history way back when. Became a reference librarian and stumbled into technology in the late 1980s, uh, working in libraries. We first set up a local area network to share CD-ROM databases back when that was still a novel thing to do. We were using a product called Artisoft Lantastic that ran under DOS. So that tells you that has been a while. And stumbled into Nobel NetWare a little bit later than that and used it for the same purpose. And then discovered Unix, and it was all downhill from there. I tell people, Mama warned me when I was younger that messing with DOS could lead to stronger stuff, and it did. And I spent about 26 years working full time as a Unix systems administrator on all sorts of Unices that are no longer around. Some of them are listed there on the slide. I did start with Linux in early 1994 using pre 1.0 version of the kernel, so that has been a while. For the last few years, I've been working as a security engineer for Bright Spring Health Services located in Louisville, as we said. And just so that you know what I'm talking about, it's always important to note that I do hold multiple security certifications, so you can believe what I say just like you could if I'd said it on the internet. One disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this session are entirely my own. They don't reflect any values or beliefs that are held by my employer. They haven't screened what I'm going to say, so hopefully I won't embarrass them too badly, and I won't have to answer to HR when I get back to work on Monday. Origins of the term password. Well, passwords as such have been around for a very long time. Uh, the use of the word password apparently dates from the late 19th, or rather 18th century, the 1700s, about the time of the American Revolution. It meant a spoken word or phrase used to pass by a guard or sentry, and that's where the term comes from. The first recorded password breach, as such, is recorded by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War from 431 BC. The Peloponnesian War was fought between the Athenians and their allies and Sparta and its allies. The Athenians were in battle with Sparta, with the citizens of Syracuse, who were an ally of Sparta. And in those days, the watchword, as it was called, would be something that you would use to identify if friend or foe. And the Syracusians noticed that the Athenians were using a particular word and started using it themselves if they were in danger of being captured by the Athenians. And the net result was if the Athenians attacked someone from Syracuse, he gave the watchword, was cleared, he was authenticated and allowed to pass in safety. Whereas if an Athenian failed to give that word, they would be killed. So it actually apparently turned the tide of the battle. The use of passwords in IT for authentication purposes apparently dates to the compatible time sharing system project at MIT from the very early 1960s. I think it was started in about 1961. And it was a historic project. It established the use of passwords to gain access to an automated system. It was the first time sharing system, as the name suggests. It was one of the first systems to use virtual machines. There's a picture there. That's not of the machine that it runs on. That machine in the picture is actually basically the terminal or console. The machine itself was an IBM, the original was an IBM 709 mainframe running with vacuum tubes. And later it was converted to a 7090. The difference between the two was transistors. It had a whopping 32 kilobytes of memory, 12 tape drives, and a 36 megabyte disk file, which for those days must have been huge. It allowed 4 concurrent users, and that's why they needed passwords, because each individual user needed access to his or her own share of the system. And not predictably, CTSS was the first to expose issues with computer passwords, some of which we're struggling with today. In 1966, there was a bug introduced into the operating system that basically caused the contents of the message of the day file to display the password file, which is not a good thing. Whenever somebody logged in, they were greeted with a master list of passwords, which in those days were unencrypted. So basically you had a text file containing everyone else's password. Oops. And one creative user, a guy named Alan Scher, discovered that he could print out the contents of the password file and use that printout to bypass the limits on his quota on computer time, because in those days you were only allowed so much computer time. I think it was, in his case, it was 4 hours per week, but everybody else got 4 hours, and so long as he didn't use up all of their quota, nobody would ever know. And he did that for several years, apparently. He finally owned up to it after he'd gotten his doctorate, and I think was eventually forgiven by the leader of the project. Within 5 years of the introduction of the password, we found some basic weaknesses that are still being exploited to this day. One, they could be compromised, as we mentioned. They could be inadvertently disclosed, as happened in the case of the password file being blasted out to the message of the day. And they could be used for resource theft, which is exactly what Mr. Scher was able to do. What emerged over the course of the next 5 to 10 years was what I would call a password arms race that in some respects continues to this day. Very early on, we discovered that passwords needed to be obfuscated somehow. And so a gentleman by the name of Robert Morris developed an algorithm for hashing passwords. If the name Robert Morris sounds familiar, his son probably is more famous these days than Morris himself. His son was Robert T. Morris. He wrote the famous 1988 Morris worm. It was really the first large-scale computer incident or security incident to take place on the internet. I remember it well because I was working in a computer lab at the time, and we discovered a virus the same week and made the local news because of it. The virus had nothing to do with the worm, but all of a sudden, for the first time, people were talking about computer security in popular culture. In addition to the development of passwords, we started to focus on increasingly stringent password requirements. We insist that people mix upper and lower case, that they use numbers and special characters, that they change them regularly, whether there's a reason to or not. And then we want to prevent reuse, and that's probably not a bad thing. So the good news is that if we do all of that, we've solved password problems, and passwords that are complex and changed regularly and can't be reused. I mean, the password security isn't a problem anymore, right? We solved that a long time ago. Well, no, not really. Despite our best efforts, that's still an ongoing problem. That headline is from last year. Passwords are still the dominant authentication method, and they are the top cause of data breaches. That will probably continue for the indefinite future, so long as people are people. Again, late last year. How your passwords end up for sale on the dark web. So not only are they being stolen, but they're being exploited for commercial purposes. Part of the problem, I think, is that IT people have an engineer's bent, and that's something that Joanna Berkey kind of touched on this morning. We tend to look for technical solutions to problems, and we don't focus on the human factor or the social sciences factor is the way I like to look at it. If we engineer a technical solution, that ought to be good enough, but it isn't. And what you see here in front of you is a very common result. There's a lot that these people are doing right. Those are assuming that P is capitalized. That's a reasonably complex password. Apparently they're changing it on a regular basis. They may or may not be reusing it. It's tough to say. I've got a few reservations about their password storage, but under the keyboard is one of the two canonical places that passwords are generally stored. This is the other. And that's one of the things that our current approach to passwords has generated. We find passwords under keyboards or taped to monitors. They're changed in predictable patterns, and we're not really fooling anybody. One side note about this particular password is it's fairly famous because the agency that uses it was involved in an incident about 3 years ago, I think. This is the Hawaii Emergency Management System. They're the ones that issued a security alert for incoming nuclear missiles. And at the time that they were being interviewed, it was discovered they had the password to their system taped on a Post-it note to the front of a monitor there. Probably not their fault. I mean, through our best intentions, we force people to resort to this sort of thing in order to keep track of their ability to log in. Insanity, somebody once said, and we'll talk about who in just a second, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's largely what we've been doing with passwords for the past 25 to 30 years. We keep trying to enforce technical requirements rather than look at human behavior. And as a consequence, people resort to sort of shadow IT, unauthorized storage, unauthorized predictable use. When we tell them they have to change their password, they don't do it the way we want them to, because there's really no way to force that and really not a good way to check for it. So password 01 becomes password 02, and the month after that, it'll be password 03. We keep trying to force them to do it our way, and they simply will not because it's too painful for them. Now, I mentioned the quote about insanity doing the same thing over and over again. That is often attributed to Albert Einstein, but it's not. It can't be. The first recorded instance took place in Knoxville, Tennessee in the early 1980s. I discovered it took place in Knoxville, and having followed SEC football most of my life, my first thought it was just a frustrated Vols fan talking about the way their football program has gone for the last 20 years, but it turns out it predates even that. It came from Knoxville, Tennessee, to be sure. But apparently it was a Al-Anon meeting in the very early 1980s. We'll never know who, because those meetings, of course, are anonymous. But I think that quote does speak volumes to the way that we've approached password security, certainly for the last 10 to 15 years. We should know better than we do. Which leads to probably the most famous cartoon in the history of password security. There can't be too many of them. And that is from XKCD, which talks about how we have tried to force people to do something that is very difficult for humans to remember, but it's not really all that difficult for computers to guess. We've tried to focus on complexity, on making people use as many characters as possible in a finite space. That typically leads to very short entropy. A better approach probably is to expand the length of the password, 14, 15, 16 characters, but to do it in a way that people can remember what they have used. And in that way, that it's also easier for them to construct. If we can give them a simple rule, we can help them construct a more secure password. Recent password theory from major government agencies, both in the United States and abroad, has concentrated on doing exactly this. For example, the National Computer Security Center in the United Kingdom is advocating that we create strong passwords using 3 random words. If you'll notice over in the blue part of the page on the right, there are several passwords there that may or may not be good ones. One of them looks like a mix of upper and lower case and numbers. It ought to be reasonably good, but it appears on the list of the top 100,000 most compromised passwords. Whereas the one below it, Red Pants Tree, does not. And that is the example that NCSC has recommended. Obviously, you don't want to use that one now, but that is the approach that they are recommended that we take, as is NIST here in the United States. A few words of caution about choosing words. First of all, nobody has recommended a particular word length. I think 4 characters would probably be a good start. I did think at one point about making my password based on George Carlin's 7 words that you can't say on television, but I decided against that just in case it was ever breached. I didn't want my employer to find out that I had done something along those lines. NCSC does recommend that you not use personal details, anything that's readily guessable or obtainable via open source intelligence, like your partner's name or a child's name, your pet's name, place of birth, that sort of thing. Sports teams are a favorite, apparently, of password construction, both here and abroad. Those often show up in lists of compromised passwords. In the United States, the similar guidance is provided by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST. In 2017, they released special publication 800-63B, which is optional for most of us, but mandatory for agencies that are covered under the terms of the act that authorize NIST, which includes most of the federal government and a good number of government contractors. NIST does offer some password tips that look very similar to the ones that we talked about from NCSC in the United Kingdom. One thing that they do recommend, and I definitely agree with this, is not to rely anymore on passwords alone. Multi-factor, we'll talk more about multi-factor authentication in a moment, but if there's anything that I can add MFA to, I do it. And if my bank doesn't require it, I would probably look at changing banks at this point, just because it's so important. NIST recommends using a phrase with multiple words. For example, if you look at the password field down below item 2, sun, walk, rain, drive. So if the sun shines, I'll walk. If it rains, I'll drive. And obviously, you want to give each account that you've got, particularly secure, important ones, a unique passphrase. I would recommend doing that for every site and every service that you log into. At this point in time, there's no reason not to have a different password. It's good password hygiene is probably your first line of defense. NIST has released some requirements. These are no longer optional for covered entities. Passwords have to be at least 8 characters long. Historically, 8 characters was a long password. Today, it is not. Personally, I wouldn't consider using anything that's less than 12 characters, and 16 is not an unreasonable number. Passwords, we no longer focus on changing passwords every 90 days. According to NIST, and I think according to common sense, you should only change a password if your account's compromised. As difficult as it is for users to come up with a secure password, the last thing we really want to do is have them change it for no particular reason once they've come up with a good one. One thing that we do need to do is screen new passwords against a list of known bad passwords, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And there are some other options that they don't recommend, security questions and password hints. Those are just invitations to social engineering. Most people wind up using or are forced to use hints or questions that are readily decipherable. The most famous example I can think of something like that were the password hints for Sarah Palin's Yahoo email account in 2008. Because of the way that Yahoo selected their questions, the only things that she could answer were questions that were easily findable by the time she ran for vice president using an internet search, and somebody did and was able to take over her account due to nothing that she necessarily did wrong. I mean, the questions themselves were the problem, rather than the answers that she gave. And we definitely want to limit the number of allowable failed attempts so that people just don't sit there and hammer on an account. We'll talk a little bit more about anti-hammering requirements in a little bit when we talk about multi-factor authentication. And recommended best practices. These are not requirements, but they are definitely recommended. And I'm on board with all of them. Allow passwords up to 64 characters or longer. As I said, I personally would not consider any password less than 12 characters to be worthwhile. And 16 would be closer to what I would want to shoot for. Character composition and special character requirements don't make a lot of sense. They don't really add anything to the strength of the password, but they do burden the end user and make it more difficult for the user to, first of all, even just construct a secure password. Just getting it to match the first time they type it in is enough of a challenge, much less even have a thought about trying to reuse it without having to resort necessarily to a password manager or something like that every time. And one of the most controversial recommendations from the new NIST publication is that users be allowed to copy and paste passwords into password managers. A lot of folks are concerned about the security of a password manager, and rightfully so. And definitely the traditional view is that you're only as secure as the password manager. My own take on that has evolved a little bit. There is risk associated with the use of a password manager, but there is risk of reusing passwords. And I think that the risk of the latter is even greater. And it's greater to a sufficient extent that it probably offsets the risk of using a password device or even something as simple as saving passwords into your browser. We have painful experience that illustrates that. Reused passwords are compromised every day. Most of the exploits that I've seen that talk about violating the security of a password manager have been theoretical, and most take place with require access to the client machine. They're not taking place on somebody's server, because that encrypting those is a fairly straightforward process. What they wind up doing is taking advantage of the password file after it's been decrypted on the local machine, and you would have to gain access to memory and finagle a way to get that clear text information out. It's not impossible, but it's a lot more work than simply being able to grab a list of known passwords that someone has used and start hammering on them in a dictionary attack. What should we do when good passwords go bad? And probably the most useful list for this is Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned list, which is a large collection of passwords that have been involved in various data breaches. You can, if you are so inclined, you can go and search and see if your email address has been associated with a pwned account. And these are accounts that aren't necessary, that are the result of passwords being improperly stored, probably on the remote end. And that's the one thing to remember about passwords. Local storage is less of a concern at this point than what happens to that password once you use it. Once you enter it into someone's website or mobile device application, you're at their mercy. Your security is as only good as their security, and we found out the hard way over the years that doesn't always work well from places like Equifax on down. Various sites that we would have trusted to maintain their systems and protect the integrity of the passwords and the credentials that have been entered into their sites have failed to do so. The current version, or this was current as of about, I guess, a month ago, of Have I Been Pwned has 613 million compromised passwords. That's quite a few. And as I mentioned, the current NIST requirements indicate that we need to be checking our accounts to make sure nobody's using a password that is on that list. The interesting thing is that not all of the passwords on the Have I Been Pwned list are simply bad passwords. Obviously, ones like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and QWERTY made the top of the list, but so did this list of what I think are probably reasonably complex passwords. There aren't too many there I would be embarrassed to use myself, but they weren't good enough not because the passwords themselves were intrinsically bad, but because somebody didn't take good care of the password once it had been entered into their system. Interestingly, those passwords appeared on the list much higher than some of these. Every compromised password on the preceding list showed up more frequently than such gems as Puppies7, BEB, 1231, and some of the others that you see there. So obviously the strength of the password isn't the only factor that we need to consider when we talk about potentials for compromise. And if we want to check lists, as I mentioned, this does require that we do check passwords as they're being entered now and compare them with known bad lists. And if the password matches, the user has to, it's not an option, has to be required to choose a different memorized secret, which is apparently bureaucratese for password. There are a number of password auditing and compliance tools. These are particularly useful for going back and doing retrospective analysis of passwords that have been entered into a database, for example, Active Directory. Several of these deserve mention. We are a know-before site. We'll probably be looking at their product a little bit later. The National Computer Security Center in the UK has a script that will actually go back and audit your AD password file. I'm sure it's a very good script, but one thing to consider before you download it and go run it is that the NCSC is part of the GCHQ. That is the British equivalent of the National Security Agency. I would have reservations about running a script that was written by a foreign intelligence service and allowing it access to my password database. But that's just me. It may be you too. You may not have any choice in the matter depending on who your employer is. But that would be one thing to consider before you just blindly go out and download it and run it. Spec Ops software has another one that apparently is quite good. It certainly has received some favorable press. All of these links will be available in the slides, and I'll post a link to the chat when we get done about where you can get the slides. But those are ones that might be useful to investigate. There may be others. Those are just the ones that I found in my research as preparing for this session. The password is probably the most unloved part of computer security, certainly of identity and access management. People have been trying to throw dirt on its grave for a long time. Perhaps the best known quote is from Bill Gates, who almost 17 years ago now said that as time goes by, people are going to rely less and less on passwords. And people have been trying to prove Gates right for a number of years, probably more often without success than with it, though that has begun to change relatively recently. For example, my favorite one, the favorite one that I came across was this headline from 2015, where Yahoo is going to update the email app to kill the password. And as the quote up the top talks about the definition of irony, the irony of that is that it actually turned out to be the other way around. In 2015, Yahoo suffered a data breach that resulted in the exposure of millions and millions of passwords. And to this date, I think it's the single largest password breach in the history of the internet. And it ultimately ended up killing the company. So the password killed Yahoo rather than the other way around. But Yahoo wasn't alone. I like this. This one has its own level of irony too. Google aims to kill passwords by the end of this year. And then, of course, right above that is a notation that the article is more than 4 years old. Didn't happen then either. But it's definitely a work in progress. I refer to passwords as the IPv4 of identity access and management. I can remember when IPv6 was introduced in the late 90s, and the consensus was that the internet was going to die in a short period of time because we're going to run out of IP addresses. And IP6 was going to fix that and save us. And IPv4 is still alive and kicking very, very much today. And IPv6 is struggling to get a toehold. Well, that's kind of where we are with authentication. Passwords are still the most popular, as we've noted, the most popular form of authentication. They're popular because they're familiar. People have grown up with them. They cuss them, they abuse them, they use them, but they're familiar and they know how they, quote unquote, know how they work. There was a time not that long ago when biometrics were seen as creepy. That would be things like retina scans and even fingerprints. That's become less common now, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. And then things like smart cards, key fobs, and other alternatives are one more thing to keep track of. I used to have a key fob for MFA at one of the positions that I had a long time ago. And I think I stepped on a couple and I lost a couple and was constantly going back to my boss saying, I need a new one. Those things aren't cheap. He cringed every time I did, but it's just one more thing to keep track of, and asking people to do that is asking them to do things they aren't really good at. We have experience of that. The future probably is multi-factor authentication. And as I mentioned, it's been around for a while. It's not exactly something new. I know we were doing that in the early 2000s. The most common thing right now, and is what we were doing then, is a password plus something else. I will enter my password and then a character from a fob or something from an SMS message or something along those lines. But the future, I think, is going to be multiple factors that don't include passwords. As I mentioned, conventional MFA, probably the most common uses today would involve a password plus an SMS or an email or a mobile app. Those have gotten a whole lot more popular, things like Duo or the Microsoft Authenticator. You don't see as many tokens or fobs anymore because mobile devices have more or less taken the place as a means of delivering that second factor. We do see some sites using push notifications. That typically that will be pressing a button on an authenticator app or responding to a link in an email. For example, Citrix allows that as one of the options to log into Citrix systems. Biometrics are certainly growing in popularity, and I think one of the reasons for that is that it integrates nicely with mobile devices, cell phones or tablets, something along those lines. When Apple introduced their fingerprint reader with the iPhone several years ago, that probably did more to promote the use of biometrics than anything else has. Even though fingerprint technology has been suggested as a means of authentication for a very long time, the link that I have posted there is to a discussion about how fingerprints were used in the James Bond movie Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, where the Bond girl was able to authenticate James Bond using a portable fingerprint detector or analyzer. And that's something the interview is with a CIA analyst who talks about how interested the agency was at the time about that technology. It's another area where the movies were actually a little bit ahead of their times. Facial recognition is another area that we've seen develop with mobile devices lately. Eye scans have not taken off, probably because they're so difficult to do and because the hardware is so expensive, but you will find those in some secure areas. That's absolutely true. An area that we're seeing some development work in would be with gestures and signatures and behavioral recognition. How fast you type. Obviously you're not going to do that as a single factor, but they can be combined with other authentication methods to securely log into systems. And they are, in fact, supported in Office Hello in current versions of Windows. As I said, the future for multi-factor authentication or modern FFA is not going to involve passwords. And we are there, but it's early days. Look, Ma, no passwords. I mean, you need to think about CAC for folks in the military or working for military organizations, or things like Apple's Touch ID, Face ID, or Windows Hello. We're already there in some respects. We use biometrics or a smart card plus a PIN or personal identification number. One question that we need to consider is whether or not PINs are more secure than passwords, and I think they can be made to be so. A PIN, if properly implemented, is tied to now these days to a specific device. It's local to that device. It does not need to be shared across a network. It's backed by hardware. The PIN would typically be stored in the TPM or trusted platform module on a PC, but could also be stored elsewhere, depending on the hardware that we're talking about. And contrary to the common 4-digit PIN that you're assigned when you get an ATM card or something along those lines, modern PINs can and should be relatively complex. I would definitely not recommend using 4 to 6 numbers. I'd want something a little bit stronger than that. Again, you don't have to kill yourself. Make it something that's easy to remember, because somebody's going to have direct access to your hardware in order to exploit that PIN. It's not something they're going to be able to do just by logging in across the network. So what do we see about the future of passwords? Well, it's fashionable to forecast the imminent demise of the password. As I mentioned, the analogy to IPv4 is strong. I think passwords are still going to be around for quite a while, simply because people are so accustomed to them. It'll be difficult for them to give them up. The force that's most driving alternative forms of authentication would be mobile devices. People are used to them, are getting more used to them. And they make things like MFA a whole lot more practical than it has been. And I think because major players like Apple, Microsoft, and Google are involved, ultimately modern MFA is going to succeed. It's just a question of how long that's going to take. That's all I've got. Let me do one thing. If you're interested in the slides, mostly I think probably for the links, I just pasted a URL into the chat. If you want the long one, and because you don't like to type on shortened ones, I can't blame you. I will give you one more to consider instead. Yeah, don't blame you. That's all I've got. If we have any questions, I'll be glad to tackle them as best I can.
I believe that the attendees have the power to unmute. If someone wants to add some comments or add some questions, maybe that's something you want to do. You want to do it that way, you could.
Sure, I think we've got a few minutes left. I'll be glad to tackle that way.
Anybody want to share their password?
Yeah.
Anyone want to share their favorite? Anyone want to share their favorite password?
Yeah. What's it? Give us a good example.
Hey, wait a minute. That's the same password I have in my luggage. No, I gotta go change it. Ooh, very nice. Spaces, my favorite password character. I'll share that.
I knew someone once, he chose to share his password with me. I wished he hadn't, but I'm glad he did. The password was space bar, and the word cadet. Space cadet.
As needing to bounce around for some of the conference, I didn't get to hear 100% of the talk. Did we talk a little bit about applications or systems where you can't pick as strong a password as you want, or as long as you want, or as complicated as you want, and sort of get into maybe some of those situations or some alternatives, what we could do?
No, because I think those are hopefully getting rarer and rarer.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. I would like the NIST requirement or NIST recommendation now is that we allow passwords up to 64 characters, and I'm a big fan of that. There really isn't much you can do. There are some older systems. I'm old enough to remember when Unix crypt only allowed 6 to 8 character passwords, and that hasn't been that long ago. I guess it has been over 20 years, but that was for every Unix system connected to the internet at one point. So we have come a long way. Hopefully those systems, well, I say that knowing that we have the legacy systems in our shop is kind of an inside joke. And I think that's probably true everywhere. So there may still be some out there that only allow relatively short passwords. The best thing we can do with those, I think, is live with them and hope that they get phased out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, right.
I think I actually have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, go.
I would like to hear your opinion on, I'm not really sure what they're called. I think they're like little dongles that you carry around your neck. Usually it's about, it has a password in it and it changes every day.
Yeah, those are the key fobs I was talking about. Typically, I've seen those used for MFA. RSA, for example, used to make one, and I can't remember. I'm trying to remember the one that we used when I was at I2. But yeah, they actually, some of those can change the password every I think minute or something like that. Some of them are time based. Some of them just do sequential changes, that sort of thing. But yeah, that is a mature technology, I would think, at this point. I haven't, as I say, the mobile devices have kind of taken the place that those tools served. Maybe not everywhere, but certainly for most commercial entities, that's going to be the case. You'll see more more people using the Microsoft Authenticator or Duo Mobile or even just plain SMS, which has its own risks as a means of delivering MFA. But those are probably more common than key fobs and dedicated devices at this point.
Oh, okay.